couple of things. We're going to save time at the end for Q&A. So we really encourage you to participate. We have really an amazing group of panelists here with great depth of knowledge. So please engage. We promise this to be an engaging, interesting conversation. Use the Pathable chat option for that. We will be discussing the current state of water stewardship, leading practices and opportunities to increase impact in the corporate sector. We're also going to touch on a few key things that are important right now. More and more companies are making commitments to targets such as replenish. So how does that fit into a corporate water stewardship, water strategy? What are some of the challenges and opportunities associated with that? You know, what's the value in a simple message? We'll talk a little bit about the distinction between stewardship and strategy. Maybe it's a little nuanced, but there are interesting things happening with respect to innovation on the strategy side. And talk a little bit about the value of water stewardship as it relates to social license to operate, social license to grow, mitigating risk, and then that strategy piece and how innovation plays into all of this. So with that, let me just do a brief intro to the panelists who are. So we have Sammy Farbach from AB InBev. I encourage everyone to wave. Thank you, Sammy. Paul Fleming, who is with Agua and brings some unique experience both on the utility and the private sector side. We've got Lisa Hook from Gap Inc. and Alexis Morgan from WWF, who leads global water stewardship for WWF. So with that, let's drop the slide. I'll sort of tee up the conversation with a few questions and really encourage the panelists to be very conversational here. If you want to go back and challenge someone's comment, please do so. If something you believe needs greater clarity, then go for it. And I will do the same, of course. So I'm going to ask what many might view as a softball question, but it's important for us to ground ourselves. You know, why does the private sector care about water? And really more importantly, not just caring, but making investments. And you know, when we think about investments, it's not just financial investments, it's all of your time, which is in short supply. So, you know, time, money, resources to address wicked water problem. So, Sammy.
Yeah, thanks, Will, and hi, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. So, as Will said, I'm with AB InBev, you know, and as a beer company, I think this softball question is somewhat straightforward for us. You know, we make a product that is 95% water, and while we pride ourselves on being a pretty innovative company, and we developed a lot of innovations in the brewing process, we still haven't figured out how to make beer without water. And, you know, our leaders of our company often say, no water, no beer. But beyond just our product and our immediate operations, as we go further up our value chain, when you look at the water footprint of a beer, about 90% of the water that goes into a beer is the water that's needed to grow the agricultural inputs, the barley, the hops, the everything that makes a beer taste great. And then going even beyond that, and perhaps even more fundamentally, I would say, as a company, we really believe that our business only thrives when our communities thrive, and no community in the world can thrive without water. It's probably obvious to say that. And so I think this point, you know, this last point is becoming even more salient in the face of climate change. Climate change is already negatively impacting water quality and availability around the world. And I think if we want to build climate resilient businesses, if we want to build climate resilient communities, we have to think strategically about water, and we have to invest strategically in water, as you said.
Thanks, Sammy. I'm going to come back to you later to talk about some of the things that AB InBev is doing on the innovation side through the 100+ Accelerator, and how that, at least in my view, ties into the strategy conversation. So, Paul, well, what's your take? I mean, why? You don't, I mean, I know you drink beer, but you don't make it. So why is it important?
We should throw in whiskey as well and other.
We've had those conversations. That's true.
Yeah. I mean, I think it varies and depends, I think, on the nature of the company, but I think there's probably some common threads, and Sam has touched on a lot of those. One is, to a certain degree, many companies have direct exposure to an increasingly erratic water cycle. And so they have direct interest in needing to lean in and address water issues. Second, I think there is a license to operate issue that's often in play for companies where perception or reality may be that their use of water is impinging upon the vitality of a given location. I think there's an ESG reporting component to that, and needing to be able to at least demonstrate how, as a company, you are leaning in to address water issues. And I think the most profound one, though, is, for many companies want to be viewed, and not just viewed, but sincerely part of the solution, right? And so figuring out how they can align their full gamut of resources, from operations to marketing to policy to finance, et cetera, with how they can then use that to address societal challenges, I think is another motivation here. And of course, water is a societal challenge. I think Carl Ganter often says there's multiple water crises. There's not just one, right? And those are playing out to varying degrees, from the American Southwest to China to Europe. And I believe a lot of companies are motivated to figure out what can we do to help ensure that we're contributing to solving and addressing those challenges.
Hey, Paul, thanks. I want to go back to something you said about disrupting the water cycle. And you live in the American West, and right now we're seeing a fairly radical transformation of the American West due to climate change, but also some structural issues in how basins like the Colorado watershed is governed. Can you talk a little bit about this? And this ties into your Agua position, but talk a little bit about what that looks like. Yeah, aridification, for example, and maybe use a better word than that if you can. But because this impacts everybody's supply chain.
Sure.
And the communities and the customers. So just a minute or two on that.
Yeah, just really quickly, I lean a lot on some of the great work that John Matthews has done, who's the ED of Agua. I think it's really about from a company perspective and understanding exposure and what to do about it, and contributing to solving problems within a community and not just the company's challenges and problems. It's really about gearing towards what do we need to be putting in place to be preparing for a continually disruptive and changing set of conditions, right? And I think that's easier said than done, because I think a lot of the interventions may be about today's climate, right? And sort of restoration or conservation and replenishment activities that are geared towards addressing sort of the status quo. And so I think the challenge for all of us is really to figure out how do we live and operate in today's climate while preparing for where things are headed, right? And that our interventions need to be largely about water and water resiliency and climate resiliency.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, Alexis, you've been doing this a long time. What are you seeing in terms of, why corporations perhaps started this, a decade plus ago, and where are we at right now? And, what does that trajectory look like? Basically the value proposition.
Yeah, well, I think there's a nuance between why do private sector actors care about water versus why should they? And those, it's, you can't, I would also say there's a lot of nuance, because the private sector is not some one, singular homogenous blob, all of whom, treat this the same way. there are certain actors who really get this, and there are many actors who don't. And I would say that most of them care about water at present. And I will say those that are, in present company are probably not in this group, but most of the private sector cares about water currently. Well, if they care about it, they care about it because they're responding to risk pressure, let's just call it. And I think that, that fundamentally underpins where some of the issues have been in this space, and this need to push that into the thinking of why water matters strategically to the business. And part of that, as Paul's saying, is like it's an existential crisis issue into the future. You may simply not have the water to operate a multi-billion-dollar facility. And we've seen the mining sector face those sorts of things and so forth, right? Like, so that's a part of it, but there's so many other reasons. We're seeing, I put it this way. I mean, this past weekend, I was around a dinner conversation, having some drinks in the evening, and people were talking climate change. That was like a first, and that was the dinner conversation. And so as that happens, you're going to see, and we're already seeing it, next generation staff want to see companies taking action. So this is an attraction and retention issue. It's, an existential issue, but it's also this, like, as you innovate and, come up with neat ideas to solve some of these challenges, I think those things can also become new product lines, services. People can innovate and change their business models. Players like Nokia are notorious for those sorts of things. And I think we could easily see that, that you start to create something and all of a sudden you have a nature-based solutions arm to your business and you actually monetize that. And it's a whole different thing that you hadn't originally thought of. So that issue of, like, where people are at right now versus where they need to get to, and then embedding that fundamentally in how you're making money and how your business is operating. I think we've got a long way to go still on that one. So we're just sort of touching the surface on that.
Okay, so now that you're going to take us down this path, I'm just going to go back to you and kind of poke it a little bit here. So yeah, the private sector is not a monolith at all. And certain sectors have been doing this for 20 years and really leading the way and providing, I think, great examples for other sectors that are relatively new to the party. But assuming that the private sector is in fact a monolith, what percentage of the companies that you see right now are addressing water from an ESG reporting perspective? I mean, as a trigger.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question to answer because we deal a lot of the time with the more leading players.
Okay.
But even there, even amongst the leading players, a lot of the time and pressure that they're facing is in responding to ESG requests. I mean, responding to various disclosure initiatives does eat a lot of time on behalf of companies on an annual basis. And everybody around the table will tell me the same thing because I've heard it from practically everybody, right? So it's not inconsequential. And I will say, I mean, it's the journey that almost everybody takes when it comes to water and water stewardship is to immediately say, like, water, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't cost us very much. And then they kind of go, okay, well, actually it does. And it actually can affect our operations and shut things down and cause problems. So then they go like, okay, let's look at our operations. And then they kind of go, oh, well, the water's not really in our operations. It's in our supply chain, and so everybody kind of goes along this pathway and eventually kind of reaches the point where, they realize, okay, we're going to have to all work together to do this. And strategically, this might actually be good for our business if we think of it in a different way and come up with innovative approaches. So that journey is pretty consistent, but up until you're in that middle to latter stage, you're still kind of in the ESG reporting realm. And so it's hard to get people to move into that further realm, and it gets really, really complicated. And I think the link back to shareholders gets its longer term share value at a certain point, and that's really difficult for companies, I think. So it's only until you get a company that's looking at long-term value creation, if they're in a short-term time cycle, they're stuck in that ESG reporting cycle because it's quarterly reporting, right? So
Alexis, you sort of kind of answered the question. Well, I think this ties into what I want to explore a little bit later in the next question around, risk to opportunity, and it ties into, what AB InBev's doing with the 100+ accelerator and what the GAP is doing with respect to technology innovations. So we'll come at this a slightly different way. Lisa, you and AB InBev are both consumer facing with multiple brands. So can you talk a little bit about why water matters? Why do you make the big investments that you make as a company? And talk a little bit about value creation, not just for the GAP, but for the communities in which you operate in, your supply chain, your customers, consumers, and your workforce.
Well done, Will. That's the answer.
Did I just answer your question? Wait a minute.
No, but 100%. I mean, resonating a lot with what Sammy was saying in terms of, and to your point, Will, around Gap Inc. is a consumer-facing retailer, and that is in large part a big muscle that we have to flex, and thinking about how to apply that to advancing positive impact in the water stewardship space. So, in terms of why is water strategic to GAP, kind of stepping back for a second on that bigger question, there's really, three main areas. It's aligned to our values, it's critical to our business, and it's important to our communities. And within each of those, what I'm referring to is aligned to our values. Our company is a purpose-driven company. We are inclusive by design. And fundamentally, we believe that water is a human right. It's important that we have a positive impact for the communities touched by our business. And that really has a clear opportunity in terms of that resonance with our employees, to know that our company is standing for something. And then for our customers to know that that is what we stand for, that is how we are looking to make product. Related to our business, just for some context, the apparel industry is heavily dependent on water to produce clothes. We estimate that it takes about 1,000 gallons of water to produce one pair of jeans. That's from growing cotton to textile manufacturing. And then when you look at a heat map of where product is sourced against water-stressed regions, it's highly aligned, red everywhere. And then quality impacts too are critically important. Pesticides used in cotton growing, as well as chemicals and dyes used in textile manufacturing, impact water quality. All of this is to say these are not only inputs to or impacts from the apparel industry, but recognizing that people and communities who are touched by our value chain rely on these same watersheds and water systems for their health and livelihoods, for drinking water, for being able to support their needs and families, and not just those along our value chain, but Will, as you pointed out too, it's our employees and our customers who are also experiencing the impacts from climate change through water-related needs. And really it's that holistic package that makes water front and center strategic for Gap Inc.
Great, thanks, Lisa. I'll come back to some of the points that you just made a little bit later. The title sort of teed up this distinction between stewardship and strategy. And Alexis and I have had numerous conversations about strategy doesn't replace stewardship. It's an added dimension to it. And we could call it stewardship plus or strategy, whatever it may be. But I think it's worth diving into because it ties into things that each of you are doing to advance stewardship and have an impact beyond your footprint. And Alexis, you said this to me a few years ago when we used to be able to travel, that risk drives engagement and value drives investment. And that's powerful, and it's in most of my slide decks right now. And it gets to the issue of, this journey in water management, if you will. It started as water management. Companies viewed it as a compliance issue within their four walls. It moved to stewardship because that was a recognition that you can't make things without water. And it is a risk, a social license to operate. And now companies are moving into, a strategy where they're investing in innovation. They are deploying new technologies, new partnerships, new business models, and so on. So with that, Alexis, and I can tell by the look on your face, you don't remember that quote, but happy to tell you where it was. Can you talk about the WWF journey and perspective from water management to stewardship to driving investment because of, the value of water?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, when I entered in or re-entered into the water space, maybe after being away from it, I was struck with how much of the dialogue was actually risk oriented. And I was thinking to myself at the time, even, I was like, there's an opportunity. Like, if you're talking risk, you should be talking to opportunity. And I tried to go down that, and I was like, wow, this is pushing a big rock uphill. Like, the entry point that everybody wants to talk about is risk. So I was like, all right, we'll play the risk game kind of, and it opens the door, right? And so, it does do that. But pretty quickly you realize, and one of the things to throw back to you, Will, is the risk dialogue gets you sort of sequestered into a chunk of the business ultimately. And if you really want to mobilize the C-suite and shareholders and everybody, you need to be talking to marketing and sales, you need to be talking to comms, you need to be talking to accounting, CFO and so forth. And if you want to get into those dialogues, you're not talking, let's sell you risk, you need to be talking about opportunity and revenue growth and those sorts of pieces. So there you need to be talking value creation. And what's interesting about, for us, the pathway on water is that if you're talking about the value of water, and this is something we went through with IFC and others a number of years ago, you come to realize that water is valued by different entities and players in very different ways. To some, it has economic value, but to many, it has spiritual value or otherwise. And so how you value water and that process matters a lot. The framing of water matters. And whether you're talking about water or whether you're talking about rivers even makes a big difference. People have notions and connections to water that language really links to. So for us, that's been kind of part of the journey. In the last little while, what we've been finding really is that we were finding that, there's been this almost underpinning to context to water stewardship for a long time. But as we've been going into things lately, there's been lots of commitments towards target setting, and people were putting targets up front. And I get it that it's a public facing and communications component to most companies. But what we were finding is targets were getting set on the back of risk and maybe something else, but not always targets on opportunity. And similarly, people were not linking their water strategies fundamentally to their business strategies. And so that was really the origins behind some of our more recent work, where we were saying, look, start with strategy, start with that. And so the report that we did on putting water strategy into context was very much oriented to say, start with strategy and then get to targets at the far end. Don't start with targets, because that's not your strategy, and you're not gonna end up with a strategic endpoint. So that's kind of the journey that we've been guiding through, is going from those different pieces.
Thank you. So this is a really important point that you brought up about, if you really want to engage senior leadership in a company, talk about business opportunity and how it supports business strategy. And risk will only get you so far. And I think we've seen that over the past several years in terms of how far up in an organization you can get when you just talk about risk. And Lisa, this brings me to you, which is, can you talk a little bit about, your business strategy and how water fits into that, and not just fits in at a high level, but what does that look like at a fairly granular level with respect to investments of time and partnerships and so on?
Yeah, well, so our, if you will, pathway or roadmap along the water stewardship journey really has been kind of a reflection of where our conversation today has taken place, really looking at it from that risk approach, moving on to stewardship. And now we're at the point of transitioning to that water strategy and business strategy connection. And so, the risk piece is really about it's a good place to start. It's shoring up the foundations. It's looking at what within your most immediate control you can have, reduce that risk through things like efficiency measures. In our case, it's with our apparel manufacturing partners. We exceeded a goal to reduce 10 billion gallons of water by 2020, and then moving to stewardship to more broadly understand that broader community impact, and saying, how do we have a positive impact for this shared water resource where our business operates? We are a partner with USAID on a Women in Water Alliance that is strategically and innovating in partnerships to advance water access in highly water stressed areas where cotton is grown, where textiles are manufactured. And then to answer kind of your more immediate question of what does that business strategy and water strategy intersection look like for us? We're in the process of it right now, but it's a really exciting time and place to be. You know, to me, the way that these two pieces are coming together are saying water is a constraint. It's a challenge that we're all facing collectively. But in that constraint comes the opportunity for innovation and catalyzing creativity and being able to say, well, that's what the parameters are now. How do we get to where we want to go with that? And with that comes in those investments in innovation, in partnerships to advance our shared interests. And really then the third thing is recognizing that comparative value that the private sector can have on addressing water issues. So I can get into more details on what specifics we're doing in each of those areas, but it's really the main point is about that shift from let's see water as a constraint that fuels our creativity.
Okay, we'll come back to the whole brand discussion because I think you know that I think all of us would agree that it's incredibly powerful in terms of engaging the layperson who probably doesn't know anything about water, but if they see it in one of your brands or one of Sammy's brands, it's a huge, powerful opportunity for change.
And I'll just say one piece on that is Sammy and I, with being in consumer facing brands or companies, that is a comparative advantage that we as a private sector bring to the water space. Maybe another industry or company type can bring another advantage, but it's shifting that view to say, what's the strength that muscle that we can have as a powerhouse? And then in our case, through customer engagement.
Yeah, and going back to the strategy conversation, this plays to your strengths as global companies and what you do best. And yes, your water footprint and your risk is important, but if you can change the hearts and minds of people that buy your products, that is enduring. And I think that's really incredibly powerful and probably one of the big trends that we'll see going forward. So Sammy, 400 brands, is that right?
Yeah, I think more than that, actually, in our full global portfolio. I mean, I think it touches on an important point, too, in terms of, business strategy and water strategy. I think we're a global company, but we're local by nature. I mean, the vast majority of products are the raw materials, including water, are sourced locally. The product is brewed locally with colleagues that live locally in those communities, and it's sold and enjoyed by consumers locally. And so I think that's why we've got this huge portfolio of brands that, really speak to what their community of consumers are looking for and looking to kind of come together around. And so I think that sense of local and engaging communities and consumers on the local challenges that, as Lisa said, they're facing themselves now as climate change continues to have their impacts, is a huge, business opportunity and opportunity to turn water, which I think is a shared risk. I mean, I think that was sort of one thing I wanted to bring in. I think Alexis started to touch on this, but the bridge from risk to opportunity is seeing risk not just as a risk to AB InBev, a risk to Gap Inc., a risk to our own company, but this is a risk we share with the communities where we operate, and we need to turn it, by solving those problems and working with the community and local stakeholders to solve the problems that are actually in a watershed. You can turn that shared risk, I think, into shared value. And I know that term is overused, but I think it's shared value in terms of a resilient future for both the people, the businesses, the economies, and the ecosystems in those places. And I think on the consumer side and more broadly, the world is looking, I think, for some optimism around water, around climate change. So I think that's another reason that's important to kind of shift away from risk and start to paint a picture of what a water resilient and climate resilient future can look like for all of us. And that's, I think, starting to drive our work as well. I think what Lisa described as the journey is very similar to ours. Risk was the entry point, but we're really trying to widen the aperture beyond that.
So Sammy, so brands that create a feeling, a belief, and an activation in a sustainable, resilient, but an optimistic future, as opposed to things are really bad and we're going to tell you all about it. You're flipping it around to, we're part of the solution. You should be part of the solution. This is what the path looks like.
And that you can be part of the solution, that you can give consumers a way to do that. I mean, our best example of this is our Stella Artois brand, which has had a partnership with water.org, who does great work in terms of water access. And, of course, there's a business benefit to us. We sell these limited edition chalices, we create brand awareness, we create brand engagement and loyalty amongst our consumers. And we also have a chance to fund really important work and amplify our impact and impact people's lives, particularly women who spend a lot of time traveling a long distance to gather clean water. And so I think, the win-win-win case feels very clear. And I think we just need to be seeking more opportunities to make consumers feel like this is a big, overwhelming problem, but there are things I can do to be a part of the solution.
If only somebody would run a Super Bowl ad on something like that, eh, Sam?
I'll pose it to the team.
Alexis is doing marketing strategy now. I don't know if you picked up that.
No, Will, can I come back on Sammy?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
One quick question, and this is both to kind of Lisa and Sammy on the back of this, which is, I mean, water, one of the great things about water is it can tell stories that resonate to everybody because everybody has touch points with it. And to me, it's really interesting that, you do have 400 plus brands, but there aren't that many of them that you've really, turned the water dial on. And similarly, I haven't seen too many clothing brands, and we obviously work with a number of them that have really kind of leaned in on the consumer facing side from a product kind of connection perspective. And do you think that's going to start to change? And are you seeing those conversations happening internally in your companies at this point? Or, why aren't we telling more of those stories and linking them up to the brands? Do you have a sense of that or not?
I think it's a really great point, Alexis, and I do think it's going to change. I mean, I'm thinking about what's happening in the US West. I'm thinking about the flooding that happened in Europe, and I think water risk and the risk of water connected to climate change are really coming home to a lot of consumers. I think the challenge back to us and our marketing teams is, how do you simplify something that's really complex in order for consumers to understand and feel like they even are in a position to engage? I think perhaps unlike something as simple as, okay, too many emissions causing climate change, have to reduce emissions, water is hyper local and the challenges are local. So I think what we're trying to do is engage our brand teams and help them understand what's of concern and top of mind when it comes to water for your consumers specifically. How can we help you kind of distill that down into something they can understand and that is authentic to your brand that then you can put out there to your community? But I do think you have to go a bit brand by brand because of the nature of water, its complexity, its location specific nature.
I would absolutely echo everything that Sammy is saying. And Alexis, to your question, yes, I feel like there's let's all stay tuned for this opportunity in terms of that brand power and connection with consumers on water. I think there are a confluence of factors happening. As Sammy has said, these experiences of water impacts are coming home to us now, and they're in our backyards. And it's no longer just kind of what's happening in the most extreme high stress areas, but what's happening in our backyards. Second is around customers asking for this, wanting to have a positive impact. How can they be helpful? How can engaging with our company, our brand, help to advance that? And that's a business and value creator, where if you're choosing between two products, one that you can put a shirt on and it's a shirt on, one where you can put a shirt on and it's also driving positive impact, there's that additionality that I think we can look to see as an opportunity for brand engagement on. So really kind of, again, thinking about that narrative and the arc that us as a water stewardship community have painted. We really set the bar high and saying, like, here's the challenge, us as like the hero in the story, here's the challenge that we need to meet, but then what's the solution? Where do we get to, and where do we drive towards in terms of kind of completing that narrative to say, here's the opportunity, here's where we can go, and what that positive future looks like.
Alexis, since you're moderating now, I'm just going to weigh in here for a minute and use it as a segue to engage Paul on the question that we started with, which is, the risk conversation and stewardship to strategy, but also a question for everyone related to brand. So Paul, if you can touch on that and then follow up with the next question that I will ask. And I know this is confusing now, but with respect to brand and consumer engagement, it always struck me that we were waiting for the consumer, the customer, to ask for something that they knew nothing about, as opposed to, well, let's put it in a way, and I forgot it was Lisa or Sammy, put it in a way that's understandable, that resonates with them, as a way to bring them in to be part of the solution. So Paul, talk to me about what has been your journey with stewardship to strategy, innovation, and then if you can talk a little bit about activating brands to engage with customers and consumers to be part of the solution, that'd be great. And then we'll talk a little bit about watershed, get into the weeds, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a lot of paths to go down based on what Lisa and Alexis and Sammy floated. So, a couple things. One is that totally on board with the notion of strategy being additive, right? Not a replacement, but additive to stewardship. But I think we can all agree that we also have a lot more work to do to improve the state of stewardship, right? So we're adding things to our list of things to perfect and improve upon, right? And I would also add, and I think Sammy was getting to this, is that the notion of value creation and moving from a risk framing to a value creation frame is super important and valuable. And I also don't quite think the ESG space quite enables us to make that transition really, really well. And I think that the value creation can play out in the stewardship realm just as much as it can in sort of the brand business strategy side. And so the value creation there may be more community focused, and what's the opportunity here to create value within a community in which you operate. Value creation in sort of the business strategy perspective is going to have a different sort of nuance for that. But I do think back to Alexis's point about starting with strategy, I think that my sense would be that is likely to be more successful for those companies for whom water is highly salient, and that salience enables strategy. For those for whom it's not quite as salient and there's not as much awareness around water and the dependencies around that, I think it may be harder to jump to strategy, because I do think that attention is one of the most precious commodities in the world, right? And that attention is going to be driven towards I think most of the things that are going to be readily apparent. that need to be acted upon. That said, I think when I was at Microsoft and rolled out our water positive commitment almost a year ago now, we did aim to build on the operational commitments that we needed to set out and set targets around. But I think to Alexis's point, we also step back to say, okay, that's a small part of the muscle of the company, right? There's a full suite of what the of competencies that exist and opportunities to engage. And so we looked at products and services. We looked at partners and customers. We looked at policy and employees, and also put to work the balance sheet through a tool called the Climate Innovation Fund, and made a $10 million investment in a venture capital fund called the Global Water Innovation Fund. So I think those are some examples of kind of some green shoots where the attempt was to move beyond just that operational domain and to think about what are the various touch points where water can be a point of discussion and an opportunity to engage, as well as an opportunity to create value, either for our customers, and in so doing, you're inherently creating value for the company, right? And so, I think that is an opportunity that presents itself for various companies. And again, to close, I think that how far you can take it, it's going to depend upon just how salient is water at this point. And that might take some time. I think it's obvious I believe for the Gap and for AB InBev that water is highly salient. For other companies, it may not be quite there yet, but that's the challenge, is to figure out how to make it more salient so it can become part of an overall strategy.
So Paul, let's say that water is not a material risk to a corporation or even sector, but they have an opportunity to have a big impact in solving water. I mean, that is a departure from, sort of the very typical stewardship frameworks that we've been looking at. And I poke on the stewardship strategy piece, because if we can collectively mobilize the companies where it's not important, but they've got a global footprint and they can really make a difference, then I embrace them, welcome them, because we all need help. I mean, that's, aligned action, basically. I want to spend a few minutes on watershed, because that's where the rubber meets the road. And those are big opportunities for every company, every NGO, the public sector, tech companies, and so on. But it's profoundly challenging, I think, as everyone is seeing. It's daunting, but not impossible. So can you weigh in on what that looks like, challenges, opportunities? And Sammy, if you can talk about 100+, because I'm determined for you to say something about it. Yeah, Sammy, what are you doing? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And then we'll go to Lisa and Alexis and Paul, and then open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Well, I'll try to touch on both. I mean, one is you're bringing up kind of the notion of watersheds and watershed health. And I think this is probably one of the more challenging things for companies to do, which is to not just focus on their own operational water use and their water footprint, but to change their focus to watershed health. I think, as a company, it's our natural inclination to set targets and goals that are in our control. We know we can achieve them. And I think that's why a lot of the early days of water stewardship were, focused somewhat narrowly on things like replenishment, et cetera. But in the end, when it comes to the multiple water challenges and crises, as was mentioned earlier, corporate water use is just one small piece of that puzzle. And I think if we only focus on that, we're still mostly playing on the margins, and we're not even going to be addressing the main drivers of the risk, this shared risk that we're all facing. And so we've made that deliberate shift in our focus through our water stewardship goal that we're trying to achieve by 2025. But when we set those goals, not just on water, but all our sustainability goals, we, I think, knew only how to get part of the way there. And that's sort of typical ABI fashion, to dream really big and build the plane while you're trying to get there. And I think, as Paul was saying, I think it's, there's a lot more space to play in terms of what a company can bring to the table when it comes to addressing water challenges. And we realize even beyond just ABI, how do we bring in the people that are working on all of these challenges, particularly the startups and entrepreneurs that are trying to solve the same problems as us, bring them in, allow them to test and see if they can scale their innovations, their technology, their service offerings in our own value chain, which most of the time creates value for our company, whether it's cost savings, whether it's finding a new way to do something that we've been trying to do and save water along the way, innovative ways to look at watershed health and address it, and be a platform for, and a springboard for those entrepreneurs. And that's what our 100+ Accelerator does. We put out a set of challenges aligned with our sustainability goals, have a cohort each year of startups that get to pilot their technologies in our value chain. And then we have a demo day at the end. We don't just keep them to ourselves, but we allow them to showcase the results of their pilots to other investors. And in some cases, we've become an investor in those startups as well, creating even more value for us. And it's getting traction because Unilever and Coca-Cola and Colgate-Palmolive this year joined us in the accelerator, which we're super excited about. And that was our goal in the end. We didn't want to keep this for ourselves.
Sammy, thank you. So Lisa, can you talk a little bit about watershed health, and if you can also ensure that you talk about the social side, the people side. So, environmental, sure, ecosystem, sure, bring in the humanity discussion to it. And then Paul and Alexis, if you can close it out, and we'll have a few minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Will. There are kind of 2 points I want to make. One is in digesting and hearing Sammy's points around the innovation accelerator, is this idea of this dynamic of a company needing to, or having, connecting the dots between putting something out there for the greater good to solve this shared global water challenge, say through investments in entrepreneurs or an innovation fund, or in our case, we're putting together an innovation center for apparel that will help advance innovations in manufacturing across the industry, agnostic to our suppliers, but just to know then and connect the dots that action will have a boomerang effect to come back and positively impact the business itself. And that's the benefit too, from thinking about these new innovative approaches. So I just think there's an aspect of connecting the dots between that positive impact for the greater good that will then in turn benefit the company. And the way that Gap Inc. looks at watershed health is really grounded in, to your second question, to your question on people and communities, is really, we are grounded in people and communities, recognizing that a healthy watershed is the underpinning for how people can access water and thrive within that watershed, needing it for all of the things that we've talked about, not only, and very critically, drinking water as a starting point, but also daily activities, cleaning, bathing, livelihoods for agriculture, for other types of industry that are within that shared watershed. And so having that underpinning of a healthy watershed to support really how that translates and comes to life for people and communities is how we're looking to make that connection. And it's a challenge. It's I think for the industry, we've been looking, when I say industry, let me back up. For everyone on this call, this corporate or water stewardship space, there's been that divide between water access and water stewardship. And now we're compounding it with climate change and resilience. But how do we look at this holistically from the interactions between a healthy ecosystem contributing to the positive needs of people and communities? And that's where we are in our journey in terms of trying to make these connections between people and planet and business. That's very simplified, but I think it's it's a putting it out there for our water stewardship community to say, like, let's look at connecting these dots to when we talk about watershed health, that it is ecosystem, but it's also people and communities. And I could keep going, but I'll hand it back to you, Will.
This is my emoji hand. So Paul and Alexis, a couple of minutes each, so we've got just a few minutes for Q&A. So Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Lisa and Sam are talking about and sharing with respect to the pivot that their company's made is really critical, right? That the goals, commitments that companies make need to be placed in the context of what's needed, right? And there's I don't want to use the term subservient, right? But there is an element here where the commitments need to be in service of advancing and addressing the health and vitality of watersheds and basins and the people that reside within, right? And so that is, it's a profound change, I think, because it's much easier to, and not without its challenges to implement, but it's much easier to sort of, as Alexis was saying earlier, kind of set these commitments and go out and achieve them. But how do you ensure that they're not just essentially a self-centered, company-centric set of commitments and are indeed directed towards what's needed? And so, like, when I think about where we could be going and what's needed is, how could we move towards a shared understanding of what's needed, what's necessary, what the most important interventions are within a basin scale, and hold companies and others accountable towards ensuring that the interventions they support are directed towards those most pressing shared challenges. I think the Water Resilience Coalition, which Lisa and Sam and their companies and others are part of, is trying to do that, but it's going to require that companies not only step up to make commitments, but are willing to sort of forego to a certain degree some of the objectives they may have that may be more company-centric in order to achieve basin-centric vitality and health. And I agree with Lisa that part of that is also focused on not just, there's obviously a strong connection between ecosystem health and water access, but ensuring that access is part of that. When we were at Microsoft, we made a commitment. I drove a commitment to enable 1.5 million people to get access through our water positive commitment in partnership with water.org. And I think that needs to be a crucial part of this going forward.
It sounds like this is a topic for a whole other session at Stockholm World Water Week. So I won't forget that, Paul. Alexis, can you weigh in on what it looks like, boots on the ground and strategy?
Yeah. So I guess the point that I was wanting to pick up on this was when it comes to, watersheds and basins are ultimately the metric on this. And I think one of the big challenges facing companies in this space is there's a question of scope of responsibility. How much of that do you take on? And to Paul's point from earlier, we got a long way to go in still dealing with the risk issues that are facing companies. But if you just take off your portion of the chunk, you haven't actually addressed your risk. You've just kind of dealt with part of your social license, maybe. And I think that that's a really fundamental question here. So if we are trying to say, look, the fundamental metric of success for all of us is the health of the basin, that requires some serious realignment of things. But I actually think we need to not just think about like aligning metrics. I think we have to go actually way beyond that, in my opinion. And I think, I think NGOs have been really good about learning. Well, I think we have a lot to put onto the table about taking responsibility for targets that are not within your control. And so letting go of that, that's what we live and breathe that, right? Like I achieved my mission through all the rest of the people on this call. But conversely, we also have a lot to learn from the private sector. And there, I think new organizational models like a joint venture to solve these kinds of things, business innovation for how we solve this at the basin level is something that I think we need to start giving thought to, because we need whole different levels of how we finance this and whole different approaches to how we go about tackling it. So yeah, I don't know. I think what I might throw out there, because I think it's a little controversial, but I think we all need to play better in the sandbox, and that's between sectors, because companies have a tendency to isolate within their sector, and between NGOs and other players to target these, basin wins, which are ultimately the measure of success that we need to move to.
Provocative is good, Alexis. It propels us forward. I'll hold you to the JV conversation at another point. So why don't we open it up for Q&A? We've got roughly 6 minutes. Allison, are you there?
Hello, yes, I am here, and I have some great questions from the crowd.
Awesome.
And people on the line, please do continue to add questions into the Pathable chat. We got a great one early on. Somebody mentioned something about the different dimensions of value that water has to different people, whether that's emotional, spiritual values of water, recreation. So how does that come in to your perspectives in the private sector?
I can take this one. I think it's a really great question. I think it gets back to the point Alexis brought up and sort of challenged me and Lisa on, which is the storytelling. And I think that, as I was saying before, I think in terms of helping our brand teams really engage in a meaningful and authentic way with consumers, I think we can really leverage our insights teams. I mean, that's what marketing teams are built for, is understanding like what are the sticky problems and barriers and concerns that consumers have, and how can we be a part of, alleviating those, addressing those, that type of thing. And so I think there's really something here in terms of, again, widening the lens of how we engage consumers on this and what water means to them. I remember that was actually the theme of World Water Day earlier this year. What does water mean to every different person? And I think, as we dig into understanding those consumer concerns and the role that water plays in their life, we really need to get creative in terms of the angles we take, not just, the way that we as corporate water practitioners tend to look at it is like, what are the large scale things happening in watershed health? Where is the water risk needle moving? Where is risk going to be next? And I know we just spent a lot of time talking about watershed health, but I think that that's, again, it's like a big, tough concept for consumers to wrap their head around. How do we tap into kind of the personal nature of water and how water challenges are really showing up in people's lives? And I think that's like just such a great space for our brands to play really creatively and emotionally and personally in.
And Allison, you want to go to another question, or does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I'll just say really quickly, agree with everything Sammy said from that. Just to also say that I think from an issue-based and NGO and even corporate water stewardship lens, it's been, here's the issue, here's why you should care about it. Let's think about the tools now that we have from a private sector view to say, what's the consumer journey of water? And, as Sammy was saying, how does it resonate to meet them where they are? So kind of putting on a different hat to help water resonate. Thanks.
Yes, it's all about meeting people where they are when it comes to big challenges like this.
That was well put. Allison, another question. We've got 2 more minutes, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, we have one question around, as we're thinking about corporate water stewardship and financing, how significant is the element of payment of permit fees, volumetric water charges, pollution penalties, et cetera? If you think particularly about the parallels with climate taxes, et cetera.
Who wants to touch that one?
In 30 seconds or less.
I will say, I'll just add, I've been skeptical about the notion of having like a analog to a price of carbon for water. Water or carbon's a global pollutant, water's a local resource. I think you have the notion of having like a levelized cost of water across a company's geographic portfolio doesn't seem like a good fit, right? And nor does it make sense, I think, from a practical perspective to have a highly segmented price of water that reflects the local sort of cost or value of water. So that aspect of water and deploying sort of the tools in the carbon space to water, I've been skeptical about, but certainly open to learning of ways that that challenge has been overcome.
Yeah, and there's actually a related question here about GHG targets and whether that relates to water. Maybe there's a question for Alexis around context-based targets. Could you share how you're thinking about that, especially when it comes to investors looking at this?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm I'm loath to get into like a whole other line of conversation. I want to chew off this, but I think with the time that we've got, I'm not wanting to necessarily completely dive in on something because I think we're trying to wrap for time. So
Alexis, that took enough time that we're now out of time. So you saved yourself. Let me thank everybody. Wonderful to see all of you. You all live in the solution. You're getting stuff done. Just thrilled to have these conversations with you and change the world. And thanks to everyone who listened in and asked questions. Encourage you all to follow up. Enjoy the rest of Stockholm World Water Week. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Will. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Paul. Bye, Sammy.
Bye.
Good to